Well, congratulations. You have made it to the end of David Clark's book, To Know and Love God. This has been a tough one, and I hope you have learned something along the way. It's probably cool right now as you're watching this and reading through the book, but today it is 95 degrees outside and not all that much cooler inside. So I hope that this sounds coherent enough, and I will maybe be a little bit shorter than I would be otherwise. What we're talking about today is theological language, a lot like we talked about in the last chapter. We looked at it in the last chapter. And if you think about it, that is a very important thing for us to think about because, what do theologians do? What do we do in theology? We use words to talk about God and the world that He has made in our salvation. So using words is like our tools, right? Without words, what would we do as theologians? It's sort of like a builder has his hammer and a screwdriver, or they need to know how those tools work. And likewise, we need to know how our language about God works if we're going to speak of Him and do theology. So this is an important thing to talk about. And like the last chapter, it's tough. What I would recommend here is that you do a brief skim through the whole chapter to kind of get an idea of where it's going, read the conclusion, and then go back and focus on just some parts of this chapter. Do the requisite time, spend the requisite time with it, right? This is a major assignment. According to accreditation, we need to assign about 6 hours of homework each week for every class. So I want you to spend a while in this chapter, but don't rush through it simply to get to the end and compromise understanding any step of the way. Rather, read that paragraph over and over again, think about that sentence, strive for good understanding, and that will just help you learn and grow as a reader. Okay, so with this chapter, one of the things to notice, just in terms of how the author is, arguing here, is the way in which the author is bringing in content that is part of what we would normally call the doctrine of God. So he's bringing in concepts that you have studied or will study in Theology 2, the doctrine of God and creation and all. And if you think about it, that's a really good thing to do. Because as we've been saying throughout, prolegomena is not pre-theological. It's not like we lay a philosophical or linguistic or emotional or economic foundation, and then on top of that, we build our theology. We don't do that. There's no way to get underneath theology to find some sort of other starting point to build theology upon, because the starting point for anything is the nature of God and His Word. And that's what theology deals with. It's the study of God and His Word, through His Word. So it really makes sense then, if we're going to look at issues of prolegomena, and theological language is one of those, it really makes sense then, if we're going to see that these are theological, that you've got to bring in the doctrine of God at the very outset. You see, it makes sense if we're going to talk about God and think about what is our language when we talk about God, we have to know who this God is that we're talking about. So it's good for the author to bring in doctrine of God issues in theological prolegomena. That's a good method for doing prolegomena. I appreciate that. Now, I will disagree as we go throughout about exactly how he's doing that, but I think the impulse and the method is sound. Now, he brings in the nature of God in order to talk about theological predication and the idea of analogy. And I want to talk a little bit about how he brings in the doctrine of God first. So what he brings in from the doctrine of God is the idea of God's simplicity. Now, God's simplicity is often something that theological students joke about, because God's simplicity is anything but simple. Right? So if you look at the words simple and complex, and the question is God simple or complex? You might think at first, well, of course, that's a no-brainer, right? Why do I have to go to seminary for that one? God is complex, right? Infinitely complex. How would I ever understand it? Okay, that's how we would normally think, but the use of these words here is in a very technical and precise way. And complex means something that is composed of parts. So this computer is complex and it's composed of parts. God is not composed of parts. Thus, God is simple, not complex. Now, what do we mean by the fact that he's not composed of parts? We mean that whatever God is essentially, that is, whatever his essential attributes are, God is necessarily, God just, you could say, is. Now, here's what would happen if God were composed of parts. Let's think about this. God being composed of parts means that all of God's attributes, those things that we know him as, holiness, goodness, love, glory, justice, all of those things that God is, if God were composed of parts, we would think of God as sort of, having all these properties. Well, he has the property of love, the property of goodness, the property of truth. And it would give the impression that God is God because he has those properties. And theoretically, if we could assemble all those properties together, which no one would ever say we actually could, but just hypothetically, if we could, we would have God. We could put these properties together and have God. See, it's not a conclusion that we want to reach, even hypothetically. And it becomes a even greater sticking point when we talk about if God is composed of properties, what status do those properties have? So let's say God is composed of all these different things, and then we ask, okay, take one of them, love. What is God's love? If we can abstract, that is to separate God's love from his person, to say that God is God because he has this property of love sort of attached to him. If we can separate those, then we can look at God's love and say, okay, what is the nature of that property? Is it the creator? Is it God? Or is it a creaturely property? And its status would be very suspect, because we can't say that God's love is God, because we've just affirmed that God is complex, he's composed of parts, and this is one part of him, so it is not identical to him. So we can't say that God's love is God, but then on the other hand, it's not really like a creaturely thing either. It's not a created reality. In theology, we want to affirm the absolute distinction between the creator and the creature. Things only fall into one of these two categories. Either it is God or it is not God. He created it. And if you start talking about God as being composed of parts, then you end up with this very dubious category of the parts of God that we can't say by definition they're God, because God's composed of these parts. Hence there's a distinction. But neither do we really want to say those are creaturely things, because now we have God being made up of the creature, and it just gets into a whole mess, and we don't want to go there. We need to, the book kind of leaves this as an open question, because there are some theologians who don't want to affirm the simplicity of God. But we need to, I think, affirm the simplicity of God and say that God is not composed of parts, that what you have in God is a sense of oneness, of his essence is just who he is. And that doesn't mean that there are no distinctions we can see in him. That doesn't mean that his love is, when we talk about his love and we talk about his holiness, that those words don't really have any distinct meanings. No, we can affirm, different ways of talking about him. But what we're doing there is we're describing the one essence of God. We're not describing these discrete parts that make up his nature. So God is not composed of parts. God's essence is a simple unity. Again, that doesn't mean there aren't any distinctions that we're never able to talk about them. But God is simple. Now, the author says, and he's relying upon the Thomas Aquinas here, and I think he's right. I think Thomas is right here. That simplicity drives us to the idea to talk about God as an analogy. Now, when the author talks about three different ways of doing theological predication, that is three different ways of using language about God: univocal, equivocal, and analogy, analogical. So those are the three different ways that we could talk about what our language about God is doing. So if we say that it is, we'll start with equivocal. Equivocal would be that there is really no relationship between my language and the nature of God. So, I could say that God is, I don't want to blaspheme here, but I could just make up anything about God, and I could none of that language that I say about God is actually at all reflects, who He is. There really is just no relationship at all. That's to equivocate. That's to say that there is a complete difference, a complete distinction between the two. Now, univocal language is to try to use language in the same sense. So that would mean that whatever I say about God, the language that I use about God, the nouns, the adjectives, are in the same sense that I would use them in, their normal English meaning, or at least one range of that meaning. So, for instance, this is not that hard. I'll explain it. So, if we say that Tim is loving and God is loving, when we use that word loving, equivocal would be that they don't have anything to do with each other. God's love and human love don't have anything to do with each other. Univocal would be to say they're exactly the same thing. So when we say that God is loving and Tim is loving, we mean the same thing about love. Now, if we affirm God's simplicity, it drives us to the third option, that is to talk about not univocal or equivocal, but analogical. That is, it has to at least be analogical and cannot be univocal. Why is that? Because because God is simple, He is not like anything else that we have in our experience. So, when we talk about God's love, we're not talking then about a part of God, a part that we can abstract away, a part that we can sort of analyze on its own, a part that we can have experience with, this kind of neutral idea of love that resides in our world and resides in God's world, and it's the same thing. No. If God is simple, then it's all God, it's all one, and therefore that love is tied with His holiness, is tied with His infinite nature. It's therefore by definition a very different kind of love than we would have, and when we would say that Tim is loving or Susan is loving or something like that. We have then, if God is simple, He is unlike anything else that we ever interact with, and therefore whatever we say about Him exists in a different frame of reference than how we talk about things on earth, right? We say that Tim is loving. We know what loving is, not because we know it only through Tim, but we know it through other encounters in this world with love. And then we predicate that to Tim. We say, I know what loving is because I know it out there. And when I say Tim is loving, I'm saying something about Tim because I know what loving is outside of my knowledge of Tim. See how that works? When we talk about God, it's different. Because if all of God's attributes are identical with His essence, then whatever we say of God is by definition different than how we would ever use that word in anything else. So that means that we cannot talk about univocal the language we use about God and is not univocal to how we would use that, about humans or other things. So it has to then be a relationship of analogy. Whereas when we say Tim is loving and we say God is loving, what we mean then is that there is some relationship between God's love and Tim's love, but they're not quite the same thing. One theologian, I think, put it so well in the early church, one of the three Cappadocians. He said, God is light, but like no light we've ever seen. That's an analogical relationship there. God is light, but like no light we've ever seen. I think that's perfect. I think you probably understand something of what that means. Yes, God is light. That's a biblical phrase. We can affirm that it's true. But yeah, he's not like this, right? That's not God. God is a light, and light is a way that captures something of who God is, but he's not like any light we've ever seen. To see God will not be to say, oh yeah, that's a light because of all these lamps that I have in my house. So I know what God is because I know light. No. To see God will be to see something totally different than anything we've seen before. But yet, light still captures something of who this God is. That's what we mean when we talk about a relationship of analogy. To say that it's univocal fails because it doesn't recognize, to say that our language is univocal fails because it doesn't recognize the unique creator-creature distinction. To say that it is equivocal fails because I think that it kind of brings God down to the level of a creature. If I say that God is loving and I say that, well, that means the same thing when I say Tim is loving, then I have essentially said that God is just like Tim, which he's not. He's different than anything that we know. And yet, we can still use language to talk about him precisely because he has come down into our world to reveal himself to us. So, in sum here, what the author is doing is he is bringing in the doctrine of God content. He's bringing in the discussion of God's simplicity in order to help us see that God is different than anything else, and therefore our language about God must be different than anything else. And the way then to describe what that language, how that language works, is to use the idea of an analogy. That when we say something about God, we don't mean the exact same thing as we would if we said that about a human, but yet there is a relationship between the two. And that's what we're getting at here. Now, the author tries to say that there is a sense where we could use univocal language about God. I think that that's where he is less helpful. I would not agree with him, although he does qualify it and clarify it in a way that I don't think makes him, heretical. But I thought it was interesting when he says on page 396, talking about how we might use univocal knowledge, he says, this concept may not exist in ordinary speech. It would instead be a technical concept. But why should that slow us down? And I would say, it should slow us down precisely because our goal is to represent the truths of God in ordinary speech. And if we get too technical, then this just isn't theology for the church. It's not helping us understand God so that we may preach and teach. And there is a danger in letting philosophy become the starting point rather than theology. So, the author tries to go here. Again, I don't think it is heretical, terribly wrong, but and then he kind of suggests it as an option, but an option that I'm not sure is really best to do. Okay, so moving on then, we have this discussion about narrative and metaphor. And because those, narrative and metaphor are both ways that we can talk about God and in his world and theological truth. And there's this whole idea of narrative theology. And, in one sense, it sounds really good. I mean, I think at our school we want to, and Dr. Haig works on this really well, being strong in biblical theology. We want to recognize that the Bible is a story, and we need to read it as a story, and that's good. We should recognize the unfolding narrative of Scripture, and we should realize that not only does the Bible tell us true things, but it also orients us to what story we're actually living in. I mean, stories are so important to us. We kind of live through stories. Stories help us understand things. And that's why epics and myths are been so important throughout human history, because they help us understand and process our life. In the Bible, well, not it's a different category altogether because it's actually a true story. But what it does as a story is it helps orient our lives. It helps us understand who we are. And it tells us what story we're living in. So that is all very good and well. But what I think the author is here is saying is that there are some who want to only look at story and say it's not important whether or not this story is true. What's simply important is that we receive this story, and this story gives us meaning and purpose and gives us things to reflect upon. And whether this story actually corresponds to anything out there is really irrelevant. That doesn't matter. Well, no, it does matter. Jesus really did die on a cross at the hands of the Roman government. He really did rise again from the dead. I mean, Paul says if Christ has not risen from the dead, he's not come out in bodily form, then our faith is useless. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, then we're of all men to be pitied. So there is a historical, factual element to this story. It is grounded in reality because God created this reality. He is the creator and he is the savior. And those two functions of God, those two acts of God are connected. He can only save us because he created us. And so God is the creator, grounds our understanding of him in the reality that he has created. So we must recognize story, but we must recognize that this is a true story and that this story is about something. We'll talk about this a lot in class. Stories are about things, right? And so from that story, we learn truths about who God is. This story is about God. And when we recognize the story and properly situate ourselves in the story, we learn about who God is. And so we don't want only narrative. Narrative is important. And I think in my circles often, I'm pleading with people, pleading with preachers, get more narrative in your preaching. That's good. More narrative in our way of thinking. We shouldn't be people who only like Paul's epistles. We should study the Gospels and study the Old Testament stories because they're just as much part of the way God has revealed himself to us as the propositional truth in Romans. We should be people who love stories, and most of all, the story of all stories. But we should recognize that this story is about God, and then let that story lead us to the knowledge of God. Once we have the knowledge of God, it's not like we can dismiss the story. But we need both to reside together. And that's what he's getting at. He also critiques the idea that all is metaphor. So Nietzsche talks about how all we have is metaphor. And there are some theologians who want to be pan-metaphorical and only see theology as metaphor, meaning that all the truth that I say about God is simply a metaphor. It's not actually referring, not even in an analogical way to God. It is rather just a metaphor for something else. We don't want to go with the idea of metaphor because what you end up with is just the idea that all is metaphor, and then all we have is something that is a metaphor of a metaphor of a metaphor of a metaphor, and there's nothing actually behind that, which is precisely the direction that postmodern philosophy is going in. In postmodern philosophy, they like the idea that all is metaphor. And if you want to think about what that would look like, if you've seen the movie Inception, I think that's what it's called, where these people are, you can go into somebody else's dream, and then the question becomes, after people go into somebody else's dream, and then in that dream go into another dream, and life becomes just a dream of a dream of a dream of a dream, and then we wonder, is there any real consciousness, and does it matter? And what we want to say in theology is, yes, it does matter. Life is not just a metaphor of a metaphor of a metaphor. We can use metaphor, and metaphor is very important in theology. We say that God is a rock and a shepherd and so on. That's a metaphor. But this is describing something true about God that transcends the metaphor, and we want to insist on that. Well, finally, the author talks about speech act theory, and speech act theory is one sort of tool in our tool belt to help us understand what's going on when we use theological language. I think this section is relatively clear. I won't go through and explain all of it, but let me just say that I think that speech act theory has some help for us, but it's not like the silver bullet that some people make it out to be. it's helpful, I think, speech act theory in general is helpful when we look at words and discourse as acts. So when anybody is actually saying something, they are not just saying something, they are doing something. Right now I am teaching. I'm speaking about God and theology, but I'm not just doing that. I'm doing that in order to teach you, to persuade you, to help you understand these concepts so that you can, teach these things to others. I'm doing something. I'm using words, but my words are doing something. And speech act theory is just recognizing that when we look at words, sentences, discourse, we ought to not only look at it in the terms of what it actually says and its meaning, we ought to make sure that we're also looking at what these words are doing, and we don't want to disassociate the doing of these words from the meaning of these words. And I think speech act theory, insofar as it is recognizing language more holistically, it is helpful. Well, that is David Clarke's book, To Know and Love God. I hope these videos have been helpful to orient you to the book, and it's probably not the book that you will have light, easy reading, nor the book that you will have mastered all the way through. But I hope that it has brought you up a little bit to another level to see some things and understand some things about how we do theology, which is going to sharpen you to know and love God better.